Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Gerald Newman, and I'm the director of the Human Rights Program here at Harvard Law School. Today we're holding a panel on the subject of building the foundations for a rights-centered polity in Ethiopia. Back in 2011, I was a member of the UN Human Rights Committee when Ethiopia presented its first ever report on compliance with the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. A great deal has changed since that time, but there is still much to be done, and new problems have arisen. I'm glad that we've been able to convene this panel of experts to discuss some of these challenges. The panel is led by HRP's own expert, our Associate Director, Dr. Abadir Ibrahim. Dr. Ibrahim, before joining HRP, was the head of the Secretariat for the Legal and Justice Affairs Advisory Council of Ethiopia, an institution established as an independent body to advise the government on conducting pro-democracy and pro-rights justice sector reforms. As a lawyer, activist, scholar, and educator in African human rights law, he both practices and studies human rights at a global, African, and domestic level. Thank you so much, and Abadir, the panel is yours.
Thank you, Professor Newman. I'd like to welcome our panelists and guests to this webinar, which is hosted by the Human Rights Program of Harvard Law School. This event is co-sponsored by the Harvard University Center for African Studies and Harvard Law School's Advocates for Human Rights and African Law Association. Before we begin, I'd like to cover some housekeeping points. Our audience will be muted throughout this Zoom webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and the recordings will be made available on our social media platforms at a future date. We're planning to have a 40-minute main session, which will be followed by a 50-minute question and answer and discussion session. The audience may enter your questions at any time during, before or after or during the Q&A session in the Q&A section under your screen. In the message section, you will find information on how to subscribe to our newsletter, and also information on where you will find video postings of this event at a later date. We're very excited to welcome our guest speakers for today. Sadala, who will be speaking first, is a prominent Ethiopian Ethiopian journalist. Sadala is known for, I would say, two things. First, she's known for founding and establishing and running for a number of years a magazine called Addis Standard, which is one of the prominent news outlets in Ethiopia, which currently is running online. Sadala is also known for her bravery and/or stubbornness in the face of persecution. She has persisted through lots of hardship. Addis Standard has been shut down in Ethiopia a number of times. Her colleagues, her employees, detained, arrested, harassed, and so on. And she has persisted through all of that. I first had the opportunity to collaborate with Sadala when I was engaged in strategic litigation in connection with the anti-terrorism proclamation, of the 2009 anti-terrorism proclamation in Ethiopia. And I got to respect Sadala as a professional in that process, because she was engaged in human rights advocacy and the advocacy of the freedom of expression and media rights, but she also was able to maintain a status of a non-polemicist professional journal. Our second speaker is going to be Letitia Bader, who is the Horn of Africa Director of Human Rights Watch. Letitia is known for her breathtakingly well-written reports I know her mostly on her reports in Eastern Africa. And our audience will probably recognize her work, although it might not be that publicly associated with her. You'll probably recognize her for her work on Maakalawi and other reports that introduced the world to the horrors of Chillamabit, Siberia, Awalabit, Sharatan. These words are mainstays in Ethiopian political discourse. And Sadala played a big part in making these things available to the world. I would also add in her reporting on Jihadawi Harakat, her reporting on Akaldama. So Letitia has been doing this kind of work for a while now, and she's been doing it well. Dr. Adam Kasi Abeba is a program officer at IDEA International. He works on constitution building projects in transitional contexts. Adam is easily one of the most prolific writers in constitutional law on Ethiopia. His work is both good and ubiquitous enough that I confess to have used his work quite frequently, both in my research and also in my litigation work, where if I find out that he has done any work on that topic, that means I have everything I need in terms of resources, in terms of arguments, and what have you. We also had another guest who wasn't able to join us. I will say one or two things about him later, who could compete with Dr. Adam as a prolific writer, but more on that later. I'll say a word or two before I hand it over to you, Sadala. Our current context, the context within which this conversation is taking place, is one that is polarized and that one that is on a war footing, to the extent that this event, although primarily an academic event, has drawn a lot of conversation and critique and non-critique. If this conversation is going to be difficult, you can imagine how non-academic political conversations are going to be difficult in Ethiopia, especially in the context where we're talking about Ethiopia having a reconciliation process. You can imagine how heated conversations and discourses are. Having said that, let me put out two or three things as a starting point, by way of also showing how difficult and multi-layered things are in Ethiopia. One of the things that most will agree on, although not uncontroversially, most will agree that there was a transition in 2018. And that transition was using the definition of O'Donnell and Schmitter. That transition could be seen as a democratic transition because the government announced it would transition to democracy, and most analysts, most Ethiopians, most politicians, opposition politicians included, believed the government. And that announces or heralds the transition towards a democracy in Ethiopia. However, that transition was also a palace coup. It was in part a result of popular uprisings, popular protest movements, especially the Gero movement and later the Fano movement, and before that the Dimsachinisama movement. But even though it has a popular aspect to it, it's also a palace coup, which is a continuation of what was called the Tilk Tahadduso, or the deep reform process within the ruling party. And that deep reform, Tilk Tahadduso process, evolved into Maddamar, which synergy in English, the philosophy of synergy, you can call it, or the process, I'd rather call it, because it was one of shifting power relations within the ruling party. Magdamer slowly led to a split within the ruling party, and the parties that split within the ruling party eventually ended up fighting in a war that is currently ongoing. Those two factions have mechanized armies of their own. Those two factions control territory, and those two factions also conduct politics in the territory they control. They hold elections. They have held elections previously. And unsurprisingly to me, one of the parties won 100% of the elections they ran in the territory they controlled. The other party, 99.5% of the votes or the seats in that election. So it is within this context that we are getting into the process of reconciliation. That reconciliation process will involve the parties to that conflict. If I can apologetically use the idea of us and them, there is a clear them in terms of the ruling parties having a history of their own. However, this conflict has brought the rest of Ethiopia in, where it is no longer just a power struggle between the two parties. It involves other Ethiopian groups, other political parties, and has also expanded to other countries in the neighboring area and in the region and globally. Having said that, let me hand it over to Sadala, who will introduce us to the context in better detail than I did.
Thank you, Dr. Abadir. Thank you for the generous introduction as well. I didn't think I deserved it, but you brought me back in memories to 2009 and 2008 when we were working on that court project for our Muslim brothers in Ethiopia who were being prosecuted by the EPRDF government. Having said that, I'm not sure how much of a context I can add following, being a next speaker right after you. But I would say this, and I don't know how many minutes I do have, and you will tell me to stop it because this is something that I can passionately go on. So you've done a wonderful introduction to the context that we are in currently. What I can add to it is that I would like to highlight on how not to understand the Ethiopian civil war today. What I mean by that is how not to understand it as a civil war that is about power struggle. This explanation has outlived its purpose, probably long before the war has started. We understood it in the context that this was a tussle between the TPLF and the Magdamer, or the Prosperity Party, which was leading the state formation based on the ideology that was articulated by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in his Magdamer book. So probably a year before the war, we could have understood it as a tussle, as a wrangling of power for dominance, and the resistance from the TPLF, the governing party of the Tigray regional state today, to hold on to some form of power after they have been ousted from the EPRDF, which they have dominated probably in a much larger fashion than they deserved. I'm sorry. So how to understand it? As the civil war evolved more than a year and 6 months down the line, and we see no end in sight. We see no end, even if we do have a political solution to it, which is a very, very simplistic form of the international community, and we all fall into that. This is a political crisis that needs a political solution to it. I think the civil war has outlived even the political solution to it. So the way to understand is that this is the war for the hurt of the state, the Ethiopian state, and its identity. This is not a war for a power struggle anymore. I'm saying this based on how it evolved in the last 16 months since it started. Yes, it started as the government's response to what it said was an attack against the army base, the Northern Command. But we all know that before that, this war has been under preparation. Long before that, statements tracing back to the war of words of exchange between the regional government of Tigray officials there and the federal government, and statements of warnings and cautions, from even including the European Union that issued a statement on the 2nd of November, that's 2 days before the war broke out, calling on the Eritrean government and the Ethiopian government to stop troop mobilization. So this, even though the government framed it as a response to an attack on the Northern Command, we all know by now, and there are more than enough evidence to suggest that this war has been under preparation before the attack was launched, or the government's narrative became an overwhelming narrative to that. So now, down the line, why we should frame this war and the atrocities that ensued after that, and the continued atrocities, which I think if there is a bold designation to it could qualify to a genocide, is that this is a war for the hurt of the Ethiopian state, one of the oldest states in Africa. And it's a fight for what this state looks like and what it should look like. And if you see the spread of the war from Tigray to the Amhara regional state, when the Tigrayan forces launched an attack in Amhara regional state and in Afar, although they have said that this was in response to the siege that the Ethiopian government placed against the Tigray government after they have chased away the federal forces on the 28th of June. The Tigrayan forces have expanded their military attack in Amhara regional state, in Afar, leaving traces of, as the report yesterday from the Amnesty International showed, traces of, again, an atrocity that was almost like what was done, although to a lesser extent in Tigray. So a hallmark of atrocity, a hallmark of brutality that this war is dotted in. What it is leading us to is the way the federal government mobilized the rest of the country to defend against the Tigrayan forces, and the frame with which the federal government narrated or packaged the war was about: an existential war. An existential war to who? It's simple to say that this is to sustain the power, the hold on power of the federal government, which is led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. It's a very simplistic definition of that. Also, it's the overriding drive is the drive from the Prime Minister's side and his party to stay put in power. But the way the response from the Amhara regional state and other regional states were mobilized, and religious institutions were mobilized, civic organizations, including civic organizations, which under normal circumstances that you would expect to be the go-in-between in calming the situation, were civilized, is a very clear indication that this war is about the undoing of the last Ethiopian state that was formed in the 1991-1994 elite bargain, which gave birth to the current constitution that we have, which we refer to it as a multinational constitution, which its distractors refer to it as ethnic constitution. Because this is entirely, the war has entirely been done against the TPLF, which the government says is the forefront author of the current constitution. So you deal with the TPLF, the rest would be easy. Let's not also forget that this war did not start from Tigray. It started way before Tigray. It started in Oromia regional state. It started as a response to the rejection of the ideology the prime minister has introduced into the body politics of the Ethiopian state. It started in Oromia regional state by saying no. And the Oromo Liberation Army that currently, according to an MP yesterday, is administering more than 396 localities in Oromia regional state, was the first one to stand up and say, no, the ideology that the prime minister was bringing in is not something that we have fought for decades. So our principle in self-determination and the right to administer and is a response to the Oromo protests there. So the war started in Oromia in response to this resistance from the Oromo Liberation Army against the federal government. So it expanded to Amhara state. So what we see after that, throughout this whole horrendous war and a massive amount of destruction of the regional state in Tigray, and all the horrible, which I think Letitia is going to highlight more on that, of human rights violations that start, isn't just about saying no to the TPLF, coming back or assumed come back to the federal state. It was about reshaping the Ethiopian state. It was about scrapping the last federal state that Ethiopia knows as a Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, which is the constitution of the 1995 constitution. So this is where we are today. And that is why I am saying the simplistic explanation of it is a political solution. It's a political, tussle that needs a political solution. I am saying this again, assuming that let's imagine for a while that there is a cessation of hostilities in force today as we speak, because that is what the international community is calling. That's what we all want now, cessation of hostilities. And then what happens? What happens is, of course, if the political leaders took the bold step, is a roundtable discussion of what is the Ethiopian state going to look like. It is a 1991-94 sort of political elite bargain on steroids, as I would say, which will ultimately end in redefining the Ethiopian state for what it looks like and how it should be administered. So the tragic part of this is that for all the atrocities that we are witnessing today, the war on Tigray and the war on Oromia that started previously in redefining the Ethiopian state is today achieving the exact opposite. It's not only failing to meet its purpose, but it is achieving the exact opposite of what it was all about. It was all about centralizing, establishing a very strong central government under the leadership of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. If you have seen the 3-4 goals of the war purpose, for example, which they called it the law enforcement, in which they went into Tigray, number one purpose is to disarm the TPLF. Number two is to replace the regional government, the TPLF, by a federally appointed interim administration. Number three is to bring the criminals, according to, I'm using the language of the federal government now, the criminals to justice. If we look at this, the war did not only miserably fail to achieve this, but achieve the exact opposite of it. What I mean by that is disarming the TPLF did not only fail, but also created now, because of the resistance, created now a center of power, monopoly on power in Tigray and in the rest of the country. Not only that, if you have seen the way the federal government has lost its monopoly on power now, we see a concentration of power in non-state actors in Amhara regional state. The Fano has emerged to be the most potent armed non-state actor Ethiopia has seen in its history of state. If we have seen how the regional paramilitary forces were armed in Afar, in Amhara, in Oromia, because they were supposed to fight against the TPLF, has created center of gravity of power, not only in the hands of the federal government, but also in the regional governments of Afar, Amhara, Tigray, Oromia, Benishangul, and all this. So that's why I'm saying the federal government wanted to control the North Command, which was under the TPLF, or was not under the TPLF, but was the federal government said they needed to take back the control on that. Ended up in decentralizing monopoly on power. It lost. This is one. The second is the federal government wanted to administer Tigray and appointed interim administration there. A few months down the line, what we see now is a federal government that is unable to administer Tigray, not only unable to administer Tigray, but also unaware of how to do that from here onwards. So this war, if you pick up all the 3-4 purposes of it, it not only failed to achieve, but also achieved the exact opposite of it. And now we have a state that has lost control over its ambition to centralize it. Where to from now is the question what we need to address. And this is not really a simple political difference that need to be solved.
Let me have you pause at that question, Adale, because we will get a chance to re-ask that. Probably not answer it, but that's a good starting point for me to jump in and maybe hand the conversation over to Letitia. Thank you, Adale.
Thank you very much, and for having invited us to speak today. I'm going to speak about 3 main trends, and this is by no means a comprehensive list overview of the key rights issues in the country. But one is obviously, as Adele touched on, the widespread conflict-related abuses, which we've seen taking part and place in the last 15 months of the conflict in northern Ethiopia. The second is widespread arbitrary arrests, enforced disappearances, often along ethnic lines. The third is what I will call shrinking space for independent scrutiny. And the fourth, if I have time, is to briefly touch on ongoing ethnic violence, targeted attacks on civilians by armed groups outside of the conflict zone. So starting, of course, with the grave atrocities which have been committed in the last 15 months in the conflict in northern Ethiopia. Since the beginning of the conflict, the Ethiopian military and their allied forces, including Eritrean forces, Amhara regional forces, and militias, have committed gross human rights violations in Tigray, including large-scale massacres, widespread sexual violence, forced displacement of civilians, pillage and destruction of refugee camps. These armed forces have also deliberately obstructed the delivery of humanitarian assistance, leaving millions of Tigrayans at risk of famine and disease. Now, Tigrayan fighters too have been responsible for very serious abuses. At Human Rights Watch, in the first few months of the conflict, we documented how Tigrayan militia had abused Eritrean refugees in Tigray in the first months. As the fighting then spread to the Amhara regions and Afar regions in July, we've also documented how Tigrayan fighters carried out extrajudicial executions against Amhara civilians in the towns of Chena and Kobo. As Tadele mentioned, Amnesty International have also reported on abuses in those same towns, including widespread, very violent sexual violence, again by Tigrayan forces. All the warring parties in this conflict have attacked and looted civilian infrastructure in Tigray, in the Amhara region, and in Afar. Now, this obviously leaves the communities on the ground without basic services, even once the fighting has moved on. Now, we've seen this most recently in certain parts of the Amhara region, and we are speaking to communities there that were displaced during the fighting and are now returning home, but don't have the means to survive or access to basic services as a result of attacks on health facilities, schools, etc. So there has, of course, been shifting conflict dynamics, but as we speak, civilian harm is persisting. So just in the last few weeks, tens of thousands of civilians have been displaced in Afar as a result of ongoing fighting there. Today, we've actually seen one of the first media reports from the region, which reported on civilian harm due to shelling by Tigrayan forces against civilians in the Afar region. Also, since July last year, Tigrayans in Western Tigray have been rounded up and killed by the Amhara security forces. In November and December, we reported with Amnesty International on how thousands had been forcibly expelled from Western Tigray. Just this year, within the first 2 weeks of the conflict, the UN reported that at least 108 civilians in Tigray were killed in government airstrikes. Now, this includes a horrific attack on a displacement camp in which at least 60 civilians were killed on January 7th. Now, those were primarily older people, women, and young children who had recently been forcibly displaced from Western Tigray. Of course, what we have characterized as an effective siege on Tigray is still in place, violating international humanitarian law and possibly committing the war crime of starvation as a weapon of war. This obviously has a trickle-down effect on a whole range of other rights, and we are also talking now about a health crisis. As we know, last month in January, the main hospital in Tigray region warned that it was running out of insulin. So this really highlighted that we're not only talking about medical facilities who are not able to provide assistance to people who are directly affected by the conflict, survivors of drone strikes, survivors of sexual violence who have medium and long-term medical needs, but also people with ordinary chronic illnesses such as diabetes. Positively, a handful of humanitarian organizations have in the last few weeks been able to bring in medical supplies into the Tigray region, which was the first in absolutely months. So the next trend I do want to touch on is the widespread arbitrary arrests and enforced disappearances. Now, unlawful detentions and mistreatment in detention stain the country's rights records for decades. As Abadia mentioned, our reporting in Makilawi, but a lot of our broader reporting during the EPRDF era was focused on these trends, including widespread torture. So there definitely was an important moment when these trends were reversed in 2018 and early 2019. Now, as an organization, we had already started to highlight and raise concerns about unlawful detentions, notably of Amhara political activists back in mid-2019. Similarly, these trends were also already picking up in Western and Southern Oromia in 2019 at the start of the insurgency and counterinsurgency there. Then again in Oromia, following the assassination of Hachalu Hundessa, which really marked a turning point where throughout Oromia, scores of Oromo civilians, particularly youth, were increasingly detained, including for prolonged periods of time, purely because of their ethnicity or perceived political affiliation. Again, now coming back to the last 15 months and since the conflict broke out initially in Tigray, we've documented 3 main waves of massive ethnically based unlawful detentions of Tigrayans. These have been both unlawful and abusive. Individuals have been unlawfully detained, had no opportunity to challenge their detentions in courts. Many have never even been questioned, but also denied access to their families, lawyers, some subjected to enforced disappearances, which was a trend we documented in particular last summer. The state of emergency in many ways basically gave a legal coating to practices we had been documenting for almost a year. What we have seen in cases of detentions of Tigrayans throughout the country is that their situation worsened, both in terms of freedom of movement within detention facilities. We're talking about both formal and informal detention facilities, limited food and denial of healthcare, but also physical mistreatment, including beatings, deteriorated depending on the shifting context outside, including on the battlefront. We've obviously focused a lot on due process violations, but I think one of the important angles which is so important to highlight in terms of these widespread detentions is also the longer impact these have on these individuals. Many of those who were detained during the state of emergency or prior to this have received very limited medical care in detention. Obviously, this is also happening in the context of a pandemic. They've been detained in unsanitary and overcrowded facilities. So those with chronic conditions have only seen their conditions deteriorate, and even those who were healthy when they were detained have not been after they were released. We raised particular concerns about the fate of Tigrayans that were deported from Saudi Arabia. Now, as an organization, for many, many years, we've been reporting on horrific conditions for Ethiopians in detention facilities in Saudi Arabia. Now, what we recently saw was that last summer, tens of thousands of Ethiopians were deported, including about 40% of which were Tigrayans. And upon return, they were also arrested in mass sweeps. Now, many of them are still in detention, and obviously particular concerns of this population because many had spent months, and some of those we spoke to, years in detention in Saudi Arabia before being returned to Ethiopia. But also there's the socioeconomic impact of those who are detained from 8 weeks and some months. What job can someone who was a day laborer go back to if they are detained for 8 weeks? We've heard of people with small businesses whose businesses were closed while they were in detention, but also to students who can't enroll anymore once they are released. And add to that the debts which individuals or their families might have racked up while they were in detention, notably to pay often exorbitant fees to be released. I want to quickly touch on what I'll call shrinking space for independent scrutiny. Again, this was an area where there was significant hope in 2018. We saw positive legal reforms at the time, and there was a real hope that we would see a flourishing of domestic and international reporting on Ethiopia. But especially since the conflict began, we've seen increasing restrictions, but also attacks on journalists. 2 journalists were killed last year. Journalists and outspoken public figures reporting on or critiquing the rights abuses linked to the Tigray conflict have faced intimidation, arrests, expulsion. A number of journalists, but also public commentators were arrested in Addis in December, including those reporting on events in the Amhara region. So some have been released, but others not. This has all gone hand in hand with regular and ongoing communications and internet shutdowns. So the first and one of the longest initial shutdowns we spoke to was the shutdown of phone and internet in Western Oromia in early 2020. Now, at the time, we raised particular concerns around the impact this was having on the diffusion of critical public health information. Then following the bouts of violence and crackdowns in parts of Oromia following the killing of Hachalu Hundessa. Now, of course, there have been communities who are quite divided on whether or not this is necessary, but the sweeping restrictions made it very difficult to assess what was unfolding and, of course, to report in real time on the violence. In Tigray, we're obviously now speaking about a 15-month-long internet shutdown, 15 months, and now a full 8 months telephone shutdown. This obviously not only affects a family's ability to stay in touch, humanitarian organizations' ability to assess needs, but also makes real-time reporting very difficult. Maybe just to finally touch on this space and shrinking independent monitoring, I would like to touch on the intimidation, arrests, and attacks on humanitarian actors. In the first 9 months of the conflict in Tigray, 23 humanitarians were killed, some targeted deliberately. Government officials at the highest level of the federal and regional governments have also aggressively critiqued humanitarian actors. During the state of emergency, at least 16 humanitarian staff are known to have been detained. This was obviously on the heels of months of ongoing questioning, searches, harassment. Added to that have obviously been the more formal restrictions on organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, Norwegian Refugee Council, the expulsions of high-level UN officials. Now, this obviously has impacted humanitarian space, not only in Tigray and the conflict-affected regions, but throughout the country, which is devastating at a time where there are a multitude of humanitarian crises and needs. Now, I don't know if I have time to very briefly finish.
You might have time for one or two sentences to wrap up, but we're going over.
Okay, so I'll leave it there and happy to answer questions. I mean, obviously, there are also serious attacks on civilians, on minority communities in Oromia, Benishangul, and so a lot of these attacks and civilian harms are also happening outside of the conflict-affected areas, having a devastating impact on communities there as well. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Letitia. Now let's turn to Adam. Adam, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Abader, and thank you very much also for the program, for inviting me. And thank you also for Zadala and Laetia for making my job slightly easier. There were a few points that I would have loved to comment on some of the assessments that Zadala presented, and also to provide some context to some of the points that Laetia, I'm probably murdering your name, but I would have liked to provide some context, some useful details, but obviously it's a short period to talk about. Now,
I would say that maybe you can circle back to those in the discussion session.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I thought as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Exactly. So what I'm going to try and come back to during the discussions if we have time. But what I'm going to try and do now is provide a context, slightly historical context to what is happening. And I'll talk about what I consider are the three axes of violence, of violations of human rights, of democracy. I'll look at the government, rebel groups in general, but broadly political groups outside of government and society. And then I'll try to say a few things in terms of where we might be headed to. So if you look at any society, any country, there are three main actors that are responsible for violence, for violations of human rights, and all of that. The first is the government, often it's called the state. And the second one are political groups, some of them armed. And the third is the community itself. There's a lot of now business are a central part of that as well, increasingly, but I won't talk much about it. Now, in the Ethiopian context, if you look at Ethiopian governments, they have historically been oppressive. They have historically been corrupt, and at times very violent. So this is the history of Ethiopian state, including today. They are violent, they are corrupt, and they are oppressive. And if, in particular, if you look at Ethiopian history, the moment in the 1940s, 1950s, when political violence took its own distinctive form, particularly, once we start to see political movements, the Gojam rebellion of peasants, in the Wayane rebellion, the Bali farmers, and then also the attempted coup in the 1960s, you will see that with the movement, the political movements, the political violence, particularly from the state side, increased. There is that correlation between the emergence of political movements and the increase in political violence. And particularly with the emergence of the student movement, that was the heyday of, as you will, political plurality. And the first government that had to confront that more matured political plurality was the Derg. And the Derg proved to be to be extremely violent. Particularly with the engagement in what is called the Red Terror, and then subsequently also the fight that it was engaged in with rebel groups. And if you look at the TPLF dominated EPRDF regime as well in the past decades, it was similarly extremely oppressive. It was similarly corrupt, and at the same time also violent in its own way. There were, Laetia talked about detentions and all of that. They were happening throughout TPLF's regime. But at least there was a sense of, especially in the past years, there was a sense of what I have called in some work rule by law. So they were trying to instrumentalize the law. They were trying to use the law to advance their political agenda, to detain opponents, to restrict media space for civil society, and on all of that. So there was this instrumentalization of law, instrumentalization of the bureaucracy. We often talk about the security sector, the police, the prosecution, the judiciary, but the taxman, the guy that gives you licenses, the person that writes you letters, that issues your birth certificates, all of those were instrumentalized to direct the state in a particular way. But at least there was a sense, the EPRDF and the DERG, they both followed the principle of other party, democratic centralism. They were certainly not democratic, but they were extremely centralized. They were extremely centralized. And what we have seen in the past 5 years in particular, and slightly before, let's say during Haile Mariam, the last years of Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn and Abiy Ahmed, is that the state has continued to be oppressive. It has continued to be violent, but it has not become centralized. So it's actually lost that centralism that the EPRDF and the DERG use. So it's neither democratic nor centralized. And so we've seen a lot of violence, a lot of violations of rights, and all that have happened since particularly 2018. When the supposed transition started. But fortunately for the Ethiopian, for the current government, the desperate search for a hero, the euphoria, the hope, and then subsequently the sense of emergency and of course war kind of diverted attention from all these failures, from all these red flags. And so a lot of people, particularly since the war started, felt like the Ethiopia may collapse. The state is in danger. And so that search for a hero and the subsequent sense of emergency and of war kind of shielded the government from the essentially the shambles that it has become. And of course, slowly but surely it is catching up. There is now, because the conflict is still extremely problematic, but there's a slight slowdown in conflict. And you can see that the criticism of the government, the identification of the fault lines, and increasing frustration with the rampant lack of law and order is slowly catching up. But so far, it has been shielded first by hope, by that search for a hero, and then subsequently by the sense of emergency and war. But it's slowly catching up, and the government would have to find a way to address all the red flags. But overall, just to summarize, our states have been oppressive, our states have been violent and corrupt, but at least during the DERG and the EPRDF, there was a sense of centralism, and at the moment, we have lost that. So we have neither a democratic nor a centralized architecture. And the second group is political opposition, political forces. Some of them are armed. And obviously, they were the main victims of the state oppression, the state violence, right? But at the same time, they also have been the source of a lot of violence and of oppression. And in fact, partly, obviously, it comes out of a sense of despair. And so, if you think there's no chance, you resort to self-help, right? But in some of our rebel forces, there has also, violence has not only been a strategy leverage, but at times the objective itself. So violence is often the goal of some of the armed groups rather than simply a strategy or leverage to win concessions. But perhaps, more fundamentally, if you look at our political forces, they have, they don't have a common agenda. The opposition forces don't have a common agenda, a unified version, vision for what the country, the fundamentals of a country. For instance, democracy. right? So if you look at particularly since 2000, before 2018, but particularly since 2018, the opposition forces were actually busy fighting each other, perhaps more than fighting the national government. So you don't see them coming together over a more urgent agenda of holding the government to account, holding the government to deliver on the promises that it has made on democracy, even if that means at times shelving their differences. And so as an opposition force, they've never really had a common standing ground to then engage the government as a unified force. Instead, they engage in internal, as a party that are extremely weak within themselves, and then as an opposition force, they never really had that unified and understanding, that prioritization of creating the conditions for the parties to exist and express their different ideas. And so, often we see them engaging vertically with the state, but more often horizontally within themselves and with other opposition forces. And so, we have that opposition forces that are victims of state violence, but also are themselves the cause of violence, and also have been unable. They are weak, but also weakened. So they are weak in their formation, but the government also tries to weaken them. And so we have this second aspect, and the third one is society. And of course, it's impossible to separate the politics from the social. But if you look at it, Ethiopian history, most of the violence was state-led. And of course, if you look at feudalism and issues of women, persons with disabilities, there is a structural, systematic, societal violence, right, that occurs outside the state structures, outside the political structures. But particularly since the 1990s, with the change in our political dynamics that focus more on linguistic groups, ethnic groups, nations, whatever we call them, and particularly since the emergence of struggles within groups, inter-societal conflict has actually intensified. If you look at from the early 1990s, some of the violence that has started to happen in Oromia, started partly because the OLF, the Oromo Liberation Front, had to compete with OPDO, which was a TPLF orchestrated Oromo representative group. And so that competition between the two started to generate violence against civilians, particularly those that are considered as outsiders in the system. But overall, even if the new system kind of created a potentially combusting environment, the centralism that was characteristic of the EPRDF kind of managed to contain, perhaps more accurately, to postpone that violence, the violence between social groups. And what we have seen is in 2018 is that centralized system kind of collapsed. But the political dynamics was very, very volatile, very combustive. And so we saw a lot of violence. We've seen mobs doing things that we cannot imagine, lynchings, and all of that. So society has become extremely involved, not just in systematic violations of rights, but more in political violence itself. And of course, I consider civil society and the media and all as part of civil society. And one of the fundamental problems is that often the media and civil society organizations, rather than being that force branch that kind of watch the contestations, they have actually become central to the contestation itself. And that is why often what we see is that political groups, whether you are in the opposition or in the government, often target media organizations, often target civil society organizations, because they are not seen as the checks on the political actors, but as part of this, central to that contestation. And it's not always, and it's not certainly inaccurate. They are often affiliated with certain ideas, affiliated even with certain political groups, and that, of course, then leads to the kind of the blurring of distinction between the various political groups. But perhaps more fundamentally, I think the support for democracy is often conditional. It's not so much about the exercise of power, but often about how, who is exercising the power, and how power can be accessed. And this is a problem, not just with the ruling party and the opposition parties, but also with media and civil society actors. So they are seen as part of the social and other problem. Now, to conclude, basically, we have problems at the social level, we have problems at the opposition, some armed groups, and then we have problems at the government level. And of course, the propositions, the suggestions, ideas we have must identify these issues and adapt to them. But just to conclude it, in view of the direction, the potential direction that the country may be headed to, and this was probably a point where I could add to some of the things that Sadala mentioned. But what has happened, and Sadala is right, is that there is an extreme political fragmentation at the moment. As I said, the centralism that characterized the PRDF actually collapsed. And what that has created is extreme political fragmentation, including within the ruling party itself, and not just between the ruling party and actors outside of it. And the power bases, the capacity to use violence has also dispersed, right? So there is a sense of a relative balance of power, if you will, that Ethiopia has not seen in its modern history since the 1890s. The last time there was a relative balance of power in Ethiopia, we had what we call the Zemen Mesafint, which was an extremely weak confederal arrangement. And if anything, I think we've kind of close to that. And I'm going to finish, Abadar. You're looking at me, I think. Just two more minutes. And so there's this, there is this extreme political fragmentation, relative balance of power that we haven't seen, not in the 1990s, not in the 1970s, when the Derg came to power. And now this balance of power, this fragmentation can lead to two ways. One is a continuation of what we have seen, essentially a continuation of the violent, oppressive, corrupt status quo that we have seen, maybe on steroids. So the dispersal can lead to that. That's one. And secondly, and I am more hopeful that this will happen, is that if you look at a history of countries that transition into democracy, often the precondition is a relative balance of power. So that's central to countries transitioning to democracy. It's very, very rare that a government itself, on its own initiative, will transition the country to democracy. And so that balance of power, that relative dispersal of the capacity to cause violence, may actually provide a hopeful burst, if we will, towards a democratic dispensation. But that requires, and this is a big F, and that requires a paradigm, a fundamental paradigm shift in the way we do things. Our actors, unfortunately, rational thinking, and even principled thinking. Sadala talked about ideology. I don't think our political rulers are actually that ideological, because ideology leads to principledness. I don't think we have that. So we don't have, we have been, principledness has been in short supply. Rationality of self-interest, even thinking in self-interest, has been in short supply. Instead, what it often drives us is emotion, where the war or the conflict itself becomes the goal of the war, rather than whatever actually caused it. So we need to have this fundamental paradigm shift into thinking, among our social political leaders, into thinking that, well, whatever we do now, authoritarianism simply means continuation of what we see today. There will be more violence, there will be more oppression, and perhaps even worse. So this idea of winner takes all that has characterized Ethiopian politics cannot simply work. It cannot work anymore. And so, an understanding that the continuity of the status quo will lead to a lose-lose. It's very important, a lose-lose, not a zero-sum game, it's a lose-lose. And so we need that paradigm fundamental shift in the way we do things. If that happens, I think we have a chance. And I want to say, and I want to conclude quickly, we are slowly, I hope, sliding into a potential dialogue genuine dialogue, which is necessary. And also, I think there's a realization, and I want to mention here Jawar Mohammed, perhaps, since he has been released, he hasn't said anything. And, you know, he was always an astute politician, but I think he was reckless at times. And perhaps he has matured. I think, you know, from what I heard, what he has said, he's been engaged in a lot of introspection, which gives me hope. So far, he hasn't said anything, apparently because he thinks things are already combustible enough, that engaging at the moment may be more dangerous than beneficial. And so I hope that Jawar has really engaged in self-introspection, and I hope everyone else from the top to below will engage in that. And I hope again that a fundamental shift in our political thinking will hopefully also lead to social reconciliation.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, and thank you for the positive note as well. One of the things I was hoping to say earlier is that all the other panelists on this panel are more optimistic, or at least hopeful, than myself. So I'm glad that you ended with that positive note. Let me ask you a follow-up question, but since I have 10 minutes, I'm gonna proceed and have you maybe address that later. You and I are hopefully going to meet at a conference soon, which is something that we may discuss even further. So you had a troika of sorts, which you used for your analysis, which was government, opposition forces, and society. I was wondering if you would be able to, or better off, using another structure to make the same analysis, but using a troika of violence or monopoly over violence, distribution of resources, i.e. the economy, or i.e. the economy is stupid, and then the discursive space, which covers, the media. So one thing you haven't touched upon is the economy, and Sadala's conversation also, I think didn't give enough emphasis, not just to the economy, but to the distributive aspects of either the war or before the war. I'll circle back to those things. The two things I wanted to cover in the 10 minutes that I borrowed from Dr. Abdi was supposed to join us today, and he wasn't able to. He wanted to talk to the topic of human rights work during conflict. And I thought this is an important enough topic that I wanted to touch upon. How human rights work is going to be both difficult and not as consequential as it would have been in a political context where there was no war. Let me start with an anecdote. 2018, I think end of 2018 or early 2019, I was able to plan a trip to Jijjiga, to the Ogaden. Jijjiga is the capital of the Somali regional states of Ethiopia, and I was able to fortunately coincide my trip with that of Felix Horn from Human Rights Watch, and during that trip, the first thing that I noticed, the positive thing, was the moment the victims of torture we were talking to, or day-to-day civilians we were talking to, the moment they realized that Felix Horn was with us, the dynamic changed. The whispers started going around, and the victims we were talking to started coming, some of them crying, some of them hugging Felix, because they were saying things like, you told our story. we thought that we would die. We thought that some of them were held in toilet holes, and some of them were tortured severely. They said, we thought we would die. The notion that you told our story was sufficient enough for us that if we died, we would have died that others knew, the world knew what was happening to us. And of course, that's once the word spread, I mean, people were approaching us while we were walking, driving, eating lunch. Scores of people were just coming over and giving handshakes and just saying thank you. And I will circle back to why I brought this story up. In that process of conversations, the one thing that struck me was in between us asking questions and informal conversations, the topic of the human rights, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission came up. And the individuals, the victims we were talking to were, visibly went from, a discourse of victimhood, a discourse of this is my story, to being really angry. They were angry at the Human Rights Commission because the Human Rights Commission came and interviewed them during their imprisonment. They thought, oh, I am going to risk it all, tell my story to these individuals so that even if there are repercussions, negative repercussions after they leave, they would at least tell my story. But what happened, at least according to them, was that the Human Rights Commission employees and or the Human Rights Commission leadership went around and told the prison guards who told on the prison guards and who did it. And therefore, the individuals who talked to the commission were severely punished for what they did. So they were really angry. They did not want to talk about the commission. So the Human Rights Commission started off with, I wasn't interested, I was more interested in transitional justice at that point, and that's why I was in Jigjiga. But the Human Rights Commission piqued my interest. I noticed how it was starting from, you could say, a legitimacy deficit or negative legitimacy. I could see how it was fully controlled by the ruling party, and I could see that from the Paris Principles point of view, there are things that could be fixed with the legislative framework of the commission. So that's kind of gave me a window, or gave me an opportunity to start thinking about the Human Rights Commission. And I was fortunate enough to engage with the law reform end of supporting the Human Rights Commission. I saw if Ethiopia were to transition to even an unstable form of democracy, I thought the Human Rights Commission would be one of those institutions that could push it upwards, and therefore committed a significant amount of time to supporting the commission. And I would like to give a shout out to the researchers at the Legal and Justice Affairs Advisory Council, the junior legal experts who worked on the research that was behind the law reform. And so the legislation was reformed. The other thing that I later followed up on was whether the Human Rights Commission was in the grips of the ruling party or not. And I will say, although I haven't done an in-depth study, the reporting that I have is that the Human Rights Commission has liberated itself from the cadre structure of the ruling party. My opinion, and this is something that's, I will preface with my opinion is that the Human Rights Commission would have been relevant, if there was no conflict. Once conflict starts, the dynamic changes and becomes one in which if a government or a rebel group or an opposition party believes that they need to violate human rights, in order to survive, in order to win a war, in order to win in political dynamics. They're not going to care about what an institution that has no enforcement powers is going to say about them. That is going to be really secondary. So in that sense, I don't think the Human Rights Commission is going to play a big role, but I do believe that it could play some role in naming and shaming, but it also can play a role in being an institution that tells the truth, that everyone can rely on, like it or not, everyone can rely on for telling the truth. So the one thing I haven't studied, and the one thing Abdi would have been able to inform this conversation on, would have been how the Commission is working towards building legitimacy, starting from a deficit or negative legitimacy. Now, coming back to the story I started with, no, I'll say two things before that. So I think the Commission needs to be building. I do not currently believe the Commission has legitimacy. I think it's doing a lot of things right in terms of every party to the conflict is unhappy with the reporting of the Commission, which means it must be doing something right, in my opinion. But I don't think it has been able to gain legitimacy, partly because it will need time to build legitimacy, but partly also because the Commission has committed mistakes that will undermine its legitimacy, including holding positions on really politically sensitive issues. The last one I remember in this, I have a couple of instances in which I felt like the Commission should walk back politically sensitive matters and play a neutral role. But the last one I remember is one regarding elections, which was really problematic. But stepping back into coming back to the big picture, I believe that the Commission or Isamoko is the abbreviation for it in Amharic. When the Commission is accepted equally by the populations of Maikadra, Mekelle, or Western Oromia, when victims call out for the Commission in all corners of Ethiopia as an arbiter of the truth, is when I think it could be successful. By the way, like the war dynamics is such that I don't think chances of having success in that regard is low, but any chance it has will have to be based on building of legitimacy. I'll add one more thing. I have run out of my 10 minutes. I want to do a sort of an inventory of human suffering. This is something I had planned, but based on the questions I'm getting in the Q&A section, which is very charged and filled with whataboutism, I would like to say that I would like to acknowledge the victims of human rights violations in the last couple of years, not even human rights violations, but serious human rights violations bordering into war crimes and crimes against humanity. I will call out the names of a couple of places in which these serious violations happened. Ababai, Atai, Aksum, Babo, Chana, Gambal, Fantale, Galikoma, Gedeo, Guji, Hawassa, Hitsaz, Humara, Kobo, Mahabaradego, Maikadra, Matakal, Moda, Nifas Moja, Shashamane, Shire, Sodo, Gawakanka, the entirety of the Somali Oromia border region, the entirety of, not the entirety, but a couple of cities in the Afar Somali region, and a number of places in the Amhara Oromia border regions. At some point, I couldn't list out all of them for definitional reasons, but these are just a few of the examples where serious violations and massacres happened. And I wanted to name these places as placeholders for the victims of serious human rights violations, to say that I stand in solidarity with you, I acknowledge your suffering, and your suffering is not better or worse than the suffering of others. I wanted to say this just to acknowledge the pain that different Ethiopians from different parts of the country have been suffering, but also at the same time to show the magnitude of the suffering. These are only serious violations, war crimes and crimes against humanity that I listed. And this is also in a way to put in context the pessimism that I evaluate things with. Having said that, let me go to the Q&A session. To give me a chance to get a breather, Adam or Zadala or Letitia, if you have any comments on each other's presentations, let me give you a couple of minutes to reflect on each other's conversations, and I'll use that opportunity to organize my notes on the questions raised.
I don't know. But maybe
Sorry,
if we go back, maybe it's Adala. Yeah, that's what I would say. If we can go back the same way, or
no, I wasn't going to intervene.
Give me one minute, and I just wanted to say this in 1 minute, and then you can moderate the panel as you wish to. Let's be very careful about parity of victimhood, because from where I see it today, even as the state goes into this post-war mood and reconstruction, what's happening today in Ethiopia is the entire Tigray being at the receiving end of not an accidental, but a deliberate, almost an extermination of the 7 million people in Tigray. In parts of Oromia, this is happening, where the government sees a threat from the Ola, where they go into shutting down communication, roads, and even access to humanitarian supply. But none whatsoever today is being endured as the people of Tigray are enduring. And this is not just because of the conflict and everything. There is a deliberate state-sanctioned really crossing out of Tigray, out of, even as we go into these fancy post-war reconstruction stories. And this is trickling down, not just by the state, but trickling down to state institutions, not just by the politicians, but state institutions. You ask the Ministry of Health, you ask the Ministry of Education, you ask every state ministries of their attempt in reconstructing the regional states that were destroyed by this war. Tigray is absent. So we need to be very careful about the parity of victimhood when we talk about this, because Tigray is a deliberate state-sanctioned siege, what they are going through today. So this is just a small remark. Other than that, we cannot compare sufferings from one to the other, but we have to be very distinct in that aspect of it. Thank you, Abad.
Thank you, Sadala. Let me add to that in agreement. Of course, there is some disagreement between what you just said and what I said. The parity of violence is not what I was aiming for. In actual fact, what I wanted to, and by the way, let me say I agree with you in terms of the level of violence perpetrated by more than one state in Tigray is, in my estimation, of historic significance. In the last time I remember something like this happened, the last time mass atrocities perpetrated by a state, including the use of I would say starvation as a weapon. The last time I encountered that is in the Ogaden, and the scale of it wasn't. I mean, I don't want to compare the scale, but that was the last time war crimes of this magnitude happened in Ethiopia. What I wanted to do, however, is to humanize the suffering, because a lot of the discourse that does disparity, a lot of the discourse that starts comparing pain is also at the same time denying the pain of the others. There is violence and there is pain on all sides, and it is the denying part that I want to go after, because when I'm looking at things, I try to humanize and see the violence in Ogaden, not current, previous violence in Ogaden, and the violence in Tigray as being violence against fellow human beings. And so that is not to deny the systematic nature of it, that is not to deny the seriousness of it. Let me say that, and Adam, let me hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. I think it's, what Sadala said is very important. The Tigrayan people in particular, if we have to put it on a scale, they are suffering extreme distress. And I think how I understood about it is from the perspective of victims. Victims, if you are hungry, you are hungry, whether it's because of the state or any other reason, you are unlikely to make a distinction. And that's why I think when we say, if you have conflict in Afar, if you generate a lot of displacement, humanitarian need, if you are a hungry Afari there, you'll be extremely distressed to see stuff passing by when you don't have anything, right? Even if there are people that need it more, that are suffering beyond imagination. So I think from the perspective of victims, it's very difficult. Yeah, they are all victims. But what Sadala said as well, I think we have to be clear, especially when we talk about the source of it. We have to, put our blame. We have to put the finger at the government. Of course, we cannot just ignore the fact that there is an armed group, there is a government that is fighting the state, and as much as we can try, it is also responsible for what is happening, what is happening there. Now, beyond that, I think I want to take us back to a bit to what Sadala said earlier about this being a fight for Ethiopia's soul. I think obviously there are ideological differences in terms of how Ethiopia should be organized. There's no question about that. But we cannot say every fight is about that. I think we make the mistake that this is a war between the Derg and the TPLF or the Derg and the OLF. It is not. Prosperity Party is fundamentally different from the whatever unitarist or whatever kind of jargon and labeling we wanna assign to it. It is it is a federalist party, or at least that's what they say. It is a multinational party. That is what they say. And if you look at the fight, in my opinion, it started out as a power struggle, and this kind of links up with what Abadu said about the economy. Of course, once the TPLF lost political power, they knew that what was coming was economic power, and potentially even cultural and other powers. In Ethiopia, unfortunately, economic power flows from political power and not the other way around. And therefore, they were extremely concerned that they have not only lost political power, but they were likely also to lose economic and another power. And of course, the difference in ideology, especially because the Abiy Ahmed has, at least the way he understands history is slightly different from the way the TPLF or the OLF understands Ethiopian history. But in terms of the responses, in terms of the kind of structures Ethiopia should have, quite frankly, I don't think Prosperity Party has any problems with the current structure of the state. I don't think they have that problem. And so basically what I'm trying to say is that, yes, there are differences in terms of ideology, in terms of how the Ethiopian state should be run, but that perhaps was more the fuel, right? Alongside, of course, boundary disputes between Tigray and Afar, Tigray and Amhara, and of course the peace with Eritrea and the history between the TPLF and Isaias Afwerki. So basically, I think it started out as a power struggle, and then ideology, contestation around identity and land between Amhara and Tigray, and the involvement of Eritrea was more the fuel rather than the cause of it. But otherwise, I think we should not make the mistake that this is a fight between the TPLF and the Derg, or the TPLF and OLF. It simply is not true. And I think there were a few questions, and I don't know if you want me to address them or should I stop here?
Let me throw. I've been looking at the questions that were being thrown our way. Most of them are comments about specific things that were being said in this discussion. There are a couple of questions that I picked out. One of them is aimed at. Two of them are aimed at Letitia from Dagam and Andy. Both of them asking about, can you look at the internment in Addis Ababa and other places outside of Tigray, of Tigrayans, as something to the effect of going after collaborators or preventative detention in the context of a state of emergency?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, there's no question that if the government has credible evidence against individuals, they should be bringing that forward and bringing those people to court. And that's something we've been saying from the beginning. The concerns are that doesn't mean that individuals should be denied their due process rights. And this has been one of the big trends we've been particularly concerned about, is both in terms of denial of access to relatives. It's moving people from one area, location to another. So it has meant that a lot of detainees have been cut off from their loved ones, which has a whole range of consequences on individuals. But also in terms of the trends we've been documenting, we've been speaking to many people who were never questioned. They were never brought before court. There was no evidence whatsoever behind their detentions. And so this also raises again and underlines the concerns that what we're talking about is widespread, often ethnic profiling. And I think you can see that also in terms of the patterns of where people were arrested. People were arrested by government police, in particular in Addis, where they would go into offices and look for lists of employees and look at their ethnicities. People were arrested in sweeps in streets, again, based on their name, place of birth, etc. So I think we are talking about patterns which raise real concerns about how many people are being arrested in these unlawful contexts as well. I do want to just very briefly touch on the point around victimhood and denial of victims. And I think, again, coming back to these issues of where we speak of communications shutdowns and also restrictions on space, this is again denying people who want their voices to be heard. And this is across communities. I mean, if we look at reporting even on the context in the Amhara region when the conflict spread there, it took us a lot of time to be able to report on what was going on the ground, because communications kept being shut off, shut on again. And this each time denies people's ability to have their voices heard. Just on the question on information coming out of Tigray, in terms of areas which are controlled by Tigrayan forces as we speak, it's very difficult to get information out. And the little that is coming out is obviously looking at explicitly the effective siege, the impact of that, And that's quite easy to know because we know what existed in terms of supplies in the region and what's been going on in recent months, and the consequences are absolutely devastating. And as we know, there are some medical doctors, notably in the capital, which have been able to find ways to communicate the impact of what it means not to have those sorts of supplies, but those are some of the few voices which are coming out from the region.
Thank you, Letitia. There's one question. We're running out of time. Let's take 15 minutes more because there are a number of questions that I picked up that I feel like we should try to address. So 10 more minutes. And this question is directed towards me. And it asks if if the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission has liberated itself from the cadre structure, do you think that the National Dialogue Commission could also assert its independence? I will take that question and forward it towards Sadala and Adam.
I see that you are rolling the bucket down the table. Okay. To begin with, I do not really believe that the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission has earned legitimacy yet. I have respect for, don't get me wrong, I have respect for Daniel Bakala as an individual, but as an institution, I do believe that it happens to be one of the institutions in the post-EPRDF reform context that the government is systematically relying on in terms of shopping for its own legitimacy. So there's a long way to go for Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to be free of the government's interference and systematic use and abuse of the institution as it is for its own legitimacy. So if the Human Rights Commission is of such outcome, do I believe the Dialogue Commission is going to be an independent interlocutor in that? No. I have been passionately arguing from the very beginning that the start of it, the formation of it already is dead on arrival to me. Because it, and I think I'm not patting my shoulder, myself on my shoulder on this. I think my argument has been vindicated by successive statements that were released by civic organizations and opposition political parties. I have since then, the last 2 weeks as well. The very formation of this commission, this Dialogue Commission in itself is wrong. I know Dr. Adam would passionately disagree with me, but I am not going to relent on that. And it's just a wrong start. First of all, the government is a party to this conflict. It cannot, under any circumstances, be presiding over the formation of a commission, a dialogue commission, most of it using a parliament that it controls 99 or 100%. Right. And so for one like that, for the second, it avoided the key stakeholders, even in its own formation. And I'm not saying the participation of political parties as being the commissioners. I think Dr. Adam understood me that way. No, I am saying the participation of the public, if the mere awareness of the presence of such a commission in and of itself, it just erases the entire Tigray regional state, more than half of Oromia regional state, communication shut down. Nobody knows about this. So this is just really the wrong start, let alone in its disregard of involving political parties even at the consultation level. So no, I don't believe this is a panacea for fixing what is wrong in Ethiopia.
Thank you, Sadala. One thing I forgot was to circle back to the Felix Horn story, and so basically, what you're saying is Isamako is not going to get the Felix reception if it were to go to Makale. But let me, with that, hand over to Adam on the same question.
Thank you, Zadai. We actually we don't disagree. I think we have distinct assessment. You know, and I'm not trying to be you know, to try to present it, smoothen it, right? We have differences, but I don't think we disagree fundamentally. The first point about the Human Rights Commission, I think, so, you know, why do we have a Human Rights Commission? We have to always ask that question. Why do we have it? Because there's a problem, right? We have a very difficult political situation. We have an extremely oppressive system. That's why we need the Human Rights Commission, right? And so, but when it is established, we cannot simply assume that that context disappears or that it will exist in its own life, right? It is, we bring it to life because it is a difficult situation, because it's a difficult context. And so we cannot assume that it will have a good start. It cannot, because the context is bad. That's why we have it. And so we have to always remember also as a state entity, you know, and, you know, somebody was asking me to make comments about how Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch reports, and they are obviously trying to make me fight with Laetia, but, you know, as a Human Rights Commission, you have to be more meticulous, right? You cannot, if, for instance, a Human Rights Commission does not have any access to Tigray, it would have to be extremely reluctant to report based on phone calls that it makes, right? While it can be seen as an acceptable methodology for human rights actors. And so, as a state entity, you know, it has to go through constraints and expectations that are different from human rights institutions. So that's very important, the context. And we have to also remember the possibility, and it's very important, that it may itself be a victim, right? So we might be blaming the victim. And a good example, you know, very recently, the Attorney General, I was very surprised. The Attorney General was speaking in Parliament, and he was essentially saying, we cannot do anything. You know, the authorities are not listening to us. That's what he was saying. There are actors that are essentially outside their control, right? So imagine, this is the Attorney General, who sits in the cabinet, right? Who is essentially saying, you know, I am trying, but I can't do anything. And now we can't blame them for not doing enough, but we have to always remember the context why we have these institutions. And so and that creates difficulty. It's the same with the national dialogue, perhaps even worse. You know, we want the national dialogue because things are extremely difficult. There's a lot of polarization, and not just political polarization, a lot of social polarization in the country. So it doesn't matter what kind of entity, it doesn't matter what kind of people you put in this institution, it will not be accepted, you know. And so you cannot assume that it will have a, you know, a flying start. It just cannot, right? And so, is it flawed? Absolutely. You're right. You know, the Tigrayan members of parliament are not there. And Tigrayans in Tigray do not have the opportunity to for instance, influence the substance of the law. And in fact, even those who are in Addis Ababa and all are complaining that their voices were not heard, right? And so, is it right that the process is flawed? Absolutely. But we have to always remember the context that makes the establishment of these institutions necessary. It is difficult. And so we cannot expect a flying start, a good footing for these institutions. That is one point. And then perhaps an important point is that the national dialogue is going to take a long period. So of course, if it starts in an extremely bad way, it's you know, it will default. But we have to think that it may actually work over time. You know, as a process, when we pass judgment in the end, it may deliver some things. And then that's one. And the secondly, and this is very important, we cannot think that the national dialogue is a panacea. In fact, even its mandate is extremely limited, right? So for instance, it's not about reconciliation. Of course, what it does may bring about reconciliation, but it doesn't have the mandate to reconcile societies. One. Two, it doesn't have the mandate to bring peace. That's not its role, right? So if the federal government does not start a peace process with the TPLF and OLF, the dialogue commission could, of course, propose that, you know, without them we cannot sufficiently do our job, but they don't have that mandate. So, you know, what I give into is that there has been a tremendous failure in communication. One, in terms of explaining what this animal is, what is it supposed to do? What is the logic behind organizing it the way it has been organized? There has been a tremendous failure, lack of ownership of this process from the government, from the speaker, from the Ministry of Justice. But otherwise, I think, you know, just to conclude, the context means that we cannot let our idea of a perfect start spoil what could potentially deliver. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Let me now turn to Letitia. Before I turn to you, Letitia, let me say that between Adala and Adam, I have listened into your debates on this point, and my sense was also that that in essence you don't disagree. It's more of in the details that you disagree. Because what I'm hearing Adam as saying is, let us not stop the process of the National Reconciliation Commission just because it has problems. Let's get it rolling. Maybe it will. Basically, doing something is better than doing nothing. Letitia, let me circle back to you and ask if you see any cause for hope in the national reconciliation process. And that is something that I'm picking up partly from Bilain Wami's question. Okay, we've lost Letitia. Let me throw that question to Sadala. Is there cause for hope, and what is that? What is it?
You know, it's becoming extremely difficult by the day to have any cause for hope in terms of what's going on in Ethiopia. Yes, there was, hope for me with this national dialogue thing, an anticipation that if we do things properly, and there was a chance to do it properly. Why I'm against it now is because there is a deliberate attempt of making it a hit and run business for the government, simply to get legitimacy, to get access to Western money, because they thought the national dialogue is just a name, like a die that has been cast by everybody. And if in case, you give some institution as a name like that, you get away with it. That is what makes it really a dangerous endeavor. There is an opportunity to do this correct, which is that start from, cessation of hostilities with all armed groups in the country. Get into cessation of hostilities. And you need to also get to your people, make this cessation of hostilities and, cessation of hostilities not conditioned to humanitarian supplies to Tigray and every affected place there. You could do simultaneously both these things, but do it right. There is an opportunity to do it right. Once you have done that, you would then make sure that at least critical stakeholders can be a part of this negotiation, this dialogue, because obviously you have to dialogue, right? As it were, we do have an irreconcilable differences in that country between different national groups. I could see a question from Rashid Abdi there, if an Amhara and Oromo differences of narrative could be reconcilable. No, but does that translate into us not tolerating to live together? It shouldn't. Right? It shouldn't. And one of the things that a national dialogue, a sustained national dialogue could do is to make sure that there is a room, there is the political freedom, there is the room to even disagree, to agree to disagree. So the reason that why I'm so critical of the government for going about it like this is because they're just packaging it and selling it to earn money. You could see that, Western governments are lining up to finance this. Fundamentally, one thinks that we could do it right if there was the will, the political will for that. But before that, for God's sake, feed the people. Open up the siege. Just break the siege in Tigray. Feed the people. It's not only the war, by the way. Drought is decimating communities in Somali, in Omo, in Oromia, in Borana, in many places. People are dying of hunger. So prioritize what needs to be prioritized and open up, that political space for this to happen. There is an opportunity, but is the government doing that today? Is the critical stakeholders doing that today? No, which brings me to say, every day that you see how things are happening are good enough to give up on this country.
Thank
to
you,
give up
Sadala.
on any hope.
Thank you, Sadala. Letitia, did you catch my question? And I think I'm going to have to end with you. You'll have the last word.
No, sorry, I didn't. I had a power cut. If you could just repeat it.
The question was, what gives you hope, given what's going on in Ethiopia?
Goodness. I mean, I think, you know, one of the comments Adam made about the hope there was in 2018, and I think this is also why it's been so difficult for so many people we have interviewed over the last few years is, you know, when you have that moment of hope and then such devastation afterwards, that also has an impact on people's ability to deal with that. I mean, I think, you know, and I'm struggling a bit with hope at the moment. And I think one of the concerns to maybe just end on is a sense that in the international community, there is a sense of normalization of the situation on the ground. And as we underline very clearly, I mean, first of all, we are still seeing devastating impacts on civilians, as Tidale just mentioned, and a lot of our work has shown in terms of the effective siege. Obviously, it's not just about supplies going in, it's about electricity, it's about banking, it's about etc. in Tigray. Obviously, as we speak, massive displacement in the Afad region and suffering throughout the country. And I think, unfortunately, it feels as though increasingly there has been an acceptance of abuses and violence in Ethiopia in recent years, which is not acceptable. And it's obviously not acceptable for the communities who are facing it, you know, on a daily basis. And so I think this is important. From our point of view, it's absolutely key that there continues to be a variety of actors that are able to independently investigate what is going on. I mean, to your point, and not to undermine Felix, my colleague, but we do hear this when we are able to interview people, especially people who've been in a communication shutdown for weeks or months, or we're able to find, they do continue to say, you know, we are so grateful that you are finding ways, but we can't be the only ones. And there needs to be the space for a whole range of actors to be able to do that. So unfortunately, I'm not going to end on a moment of hope. I actually feel that we're in a moment where I look at, you know, the kind of a lot of engagement in Ethiopia seems to suggest that a very low bar is acceptable, and it isn't. Thank you.
Thank you, Letitia. Adam, in 1 minute, if there is cause for hope that you'd like to point us to.
Well, I mean, I think there's one thing that I always say, you know, we have to be hopeful, because if we are not hopeful, we basically are not trying to show the direction, right? So we're basically despairing. And all, I mean, that doesn't, of course, mean complacency, right? We should still recognize the issues. We must work to resolve them, but we must remain positive. That's one. And secondly, I think, you know, yes, this national dialogue is extremely flawed. And just a little bit of fact, by the way, you know, I don't want to depress anyone, but if you look at statistically, it's twice, at least from other countries' experience, the dialogue is twice as likely to fail than to succeed, right? That's and even when, you know, when I mean succeed, it might be only partially, right? So, you know, we are not engaging in it because we think it will succeed, but we have to try and make it work. And so what I will advise our for instance, opposition force and all is that, of course, you have to be critical, try to fix any flaws that are there, but at the same time, band together, you know, work together as an opposition, focus on, for instance, getting the process right, focus on some of the fundamental things that you agree on, hold the government to its promise. So we can't reject it. Maybe indeed, as Sadala said, this is just, you know, for external consumption, but we cannot just dismiss it like that, because, you know, the alternative is not that there will be better dialogue, but there will be no dialogue. You know, I don't think if we abandon this, suddenly the government will be like, okay, now the opposition are not coming. So we, you know, from my experience, this engagement, whether it's in elections or in process like this, of course, it leads to the failure of the dialogue, but it often puts the opposition and all in a worse position than they were. And this is almost universal. from my experience in Africa, and beyond. And so, disengagement is simply not a choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Let me, with this, thank the panelists. You took time from your busy schedules to engage in this conversation. Thank you for your time. Thank you for, and I would like to also thank the participants for the active participation and for being here to listen into this conversation, which was not easy. So with this, I'll end the webinar. Thank you.